come to you all the way from Plant City. So I'm a Florida native, and it's always an great opportunity to be able to have some local event that I can participate in here today. And as mentioned, I work with Azure Global Engineering Organization. So we have service delivery over our sovereign cloud architecture. So that includes Azure as it's deployed both for the U.S. government with Azure government and some of our air-gapped clouds for secret and top secret. We also have sovereign clouds in other regions around the globe. My particular focus, though, is here within the United States and working with the U.S. Department of Defense and the Defense Industrial Base. My presentation this morning is really to introduce you to some of the solutions that we have to give you an opportunity to leverage the cloud in order to increase your security posture and, of course, become compliant with some of the regulations that are imposed on you in terms of looking at the work with the U.S. Department of Defense. So, in terms of looking at today's discussion, I have several blogs that have been, basically pulled together a number of the information that has historically been somewhat difficult to track down. So if you look at, for example, the compliance that would be applied to a commercial environment versus our government cloud offerings, et cetera, some of which we'll go through here this morning, is outlined within my blog series, as well as our cybersecurity maturity model certification solutions, such as the Acceleration Program. So I encourage you, today to look at, some of the resources that we have available through our blogs, and as a follow-up, the presentation will be have links for you. So the very first question I often get from many of my customers and partners is, really, if you need to become compliant with CMMC, which cloud within Microsoft would you need to choose? Because we do have multiple different enclaves. Now, if you look at this, it's a pretty big eye chart in terms of, the different cloud enclaves that Microsoft provides, both for commercial, multi-tenant, as well as for a government cloud. So I like to do a bit of a history to give a perspective of how we ended up with multiple different data enclaves. So if you go back over a decade ago, I was working on the very first deployments for what would become Office 365, right? So in the early days, it was just a public multi-tenant productivity solution that included Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Link Online, which is now, of course, evolved into Teams. In terms of looking at that offering, initially it was regionalized in 3 different locations around the globe, and we've since been able to provide a level of data residency across multiple different regions. We have over 50 regions now. United States, of course, there's regions in other countries like Canada, UK, Australia, even South Africa, etc. So we have many different regions. They offer data residency, so it gives you an opportunity to select our commercial environment and have your data be able to be stored at rest within a particular region. But a big takeaway with the commercial public multi-tenant environment is it is a global service, right? So we have a global network, and we have a follow-the-sun support model. So if you look at, for example, calling into Microsoft to get support, even though you have data residency that may be in a specific region, such as the United States or the United Kingdom, you may get support from foreign nationals, of course, across the globe, which did prohibit us, especially early on, from being able to work with the U.S. government. So we built an enclave of the productivity suite, which is now known as a government community cloud. That's GCC for short. And the government community cloud is part of our commercial multi-tenant architecture. It's just in terms of looking at those productivity suite services, email, Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, etc. It's all stored within the continental United States, and it is managed by U.S. persons. But there's a lot of shared services such as the network and Azure Active Directory, which is the identity for the platform, et cetera, which are still global in terms of looking at support and the network, et cetera, that's connected to it. So it worked really well for us being able to get our first FSMA and then FedRAMP authorization in the cloud. If you look at the user population that's in the GCC, it's predominantly state and local government customers, as well as some of the federal civilian agencies that would include, the NASA, et cetera. So they're in GCC. Now this all comes along around the time that we introduced our compute platform with Azure. And we took many of the services that you would find in the productivity suite and made them available as a first-class capability. So if you look at the directory services being Azure Active Directory, if you look at encryption, document encryption, et cetera, we've got Azure Information Protection, Microsoft Information Protection, et cetera, all part of that Azure fabric. And that also extended out to provide infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, again, is regionalized across the globe, so you have the ability to deploy services in Azure that would be regionalized. The big takeaway here is that if within the commercial public multi-tenant environment that you'd see on this left-hand side of the chart, is that it provides data residency as opposed to what I'll talk about next, which is data sovereignty. So as we look at being able to capture the market for the U.S. Department of Defense, we went to the DoD, and of course they had requirements around the Security Requirements Guide, SRG, Impact Level 5. And IL5 has some very unique restrictions in that not only does it require like U.S. persons and to have the network contained or restricted to the continental United States or CONUS, but it also had some very strict firewall requirements as well. So in terms of looking at this service, we had to build completely isolated, both physically and virtually segmented from the public multi-tenant side of the house. So this is a truly sovereign cloud. And it began with infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. It also gave us a foundation to start building out software as a service as well. So we did deliver to the U.S. Department of Defense our DoD environment for Office 365. It's based on that SRG IL5 control set. The challenge with that is that it was restricted with those firewalls so that the only people who were allowed to have access to it had to come in through their cloud access point, through the CAP. And that really did prohibit most of the defense industrial base, as well as the other like federal cabinet level agencies that also had a requirement for data sovereignty. It would be like the FBI and DOJ, DHS, et cetera. So we did a twin environment. The twin environment of the DoD is now what's known as Government Community Cloud High, or GCC High. It is really the same managed services that you find with the DoD environment at that IL5 control set, except for now it's available to you as a defense contractor through an eligibility process. What you'll find there is because it has true data sovereignty, we're able to now have a contractual obligation for protection of controlled and classified information, both for CUI basic as well as for CUI specified. That would extend to an amendment that we can offer for international traffic and arms regulations. So ITAR, export controlled data, ITAR, EAR, nuclear data, et cetera, are all permissible to be stored in the U.S. sovereign cloud. Now, the combination of GCC High and Azure Government tends to be a branding challenge for us. The best way I like to describe the GCC High branding is that it really applies to anything that's software as a service with Microsoft. So the productivity suite, Office 365, GCC High branding. We have Windows 365 coming with the GCC High branding. Azure Active Directory is also GCC High branding. So anything that's like per user licensing is typically branded with GCC High. The compute platform that would include infrastructure as a service and platform as a service is Azure Government. But don't get tied up on the branding. Azure Government and GCC High are really pretty much interchangeable in terms of looking at the environment. It also gave us a platform now that we're delivering additional services. So we have the Dynamics 365 suite like CRM Online now available within the Sovereign Cloud. We're bringing GitHub available within the Sovereign Cloud as well. So there's a number of capabilities where we're closing the gap in terms of functionality to have as close to parity within the Sovereign Cloud as we do within our commercial public multi-tenant. The rule of thumb is that once we deliver a service within the Sovereign Cloud, that we would stay within parity of commercial within 30 days. So, a lot of the pain that many of the customers have had historically is that there's been missing capabilities. Now that we're closing the gap in that functionality, you'll see that it'll be very close in terms of both the capabilities and user experience within the Sovereign Cloud. So moving on, all right, so the one thing that is a common misperception that I've seen is that, if you look at being able to go and procure from Microsoft a cloud that is ITAR compliant, many customers or partners would have an automatic expectation that by getting GCC High that you would be somehow magically compliant with data handling for controlled and classified information. What I like to point out here is that it will always be a shared scope of responsibility. Microsoft, of course, has a scope of responsibility that would be managing and running the data center and the physical controls that we'd have to put into place to become compliant with SRG IL5 or with CMMC levels 1 through 5, etc. But there is also a configuration that you as a customer would have in order to fully fulfill your obligations and be able to demonstrate compliance with, for example, CMMC. Now, you get a lot more mileage out of software as a service. As you can imagine, you would end up having, and here's a good illustration, a pie chart, where Microsoft would own a larger scope of controls that would be able to provide you with a level of inheritance, or what we would refer to as reciprocity, from the cloud service provider. So the Microsoft responsibility may be physical data center and protection of data, but then if you look at the customer scope of responsibility, that's where you're going to introduce data protection policies that you as an organization would need to implement. By way of example, one of the common questions I get around GCC High is saying, okay, well, if Microsoft manages this environment and you have a requirement for US persons and CONUS-based network that would give us a contractual obligation on the back end to be able to adhere to export controlled data like ITAR and EAR, does that translate to the customer also having to have a similar responsibility to only allow people who are US persons or connections from the continental United States into that environment? And the short answer is we don't dictate who you give access to the environment, nor do we impose any kind of specific data protection like connections from outside the United States on your user populations. That's up to you to decide. So that's an organization scope of responsibility. And most of my customers that are in, for example, GCC High do have valid reasons why they would have foreign nationals and connections from outside the continental United States. You just have to make sure that if you've got, for example, ITAR data within the tenant, that you're locking down and applying data protection policies to that data appropriately, but that is your scope of responsibility to protect that data. We're the most trusted and compliant cloud in terms of looking at the number of regulations and standards and certifications that we've been able to achieve. If you look at the US government alone, many of these are not mutually exclusive. For example, I've talked about the security requirements guide, so we are able to achieve up to an IL5 in terms of looking at the level of control scope that we have within our Azure government and GCC High environment. That also translates to IL4 and FedRAMP High, et cetera. So there's a high watermark for compliance that we're able to achieve within our government clouds. We also are able to offer even criminal justice information system for any of you that are working with law enforcement, as well as if you were to extend out to additional requirements around HIPAA and other industry level regulations that we're able to help you to demonstrate compliance within our U.S. sovereign cloud, as well as, in many cases, even our commercial clouds. So to look at it broken down in terms of CMMC. So CMMC, at the end of the day, you can be able to demonstrate compliance with CMMC level 1 in any one of our clouds, right? There's no specific requirement for CMMC level 1 to introduce the requirement for U.S. persons. That's really when you get into controlled and classified information. So you'll see here that we've got across the column for federal contract information and CMMC levels 1 and 2 that you're able to demonstrate compliance with that in commercial as well as government. Although I do throw caution to the wind, because if you look at getting into the higher levels of CMMC, level 3 through 5, where you now have an obligation to protect controlled and classified information, that's where you would have a requirement for the government cloud offerings. So that would be GCC and GCC High. Predominantly, the difference between GCC and GCC High, as I mentioned before, is data residency versus data sovereignty. Data sovereignty gives you that contractual obligation from Microsoft for protection of CUI specified, so that includes ITAR and export controlled data, as well as nuclear information, et cetera, versus the GCC offering, where we do have a DFAR 7012 letter of attestation, so you can be able to demonstrate compliance with the CMMC level 3, so long as you would not be trying to store ITAR data within GCC. So if you look in the future, whether you're CMMC level 1 or level 3, you may look into the future and the different types of data that you may be obligated to protect. If in the future you would have a requirement for controlled and classified information, especially export controlled data, we do highly recommend the GCC High and Azure government environment. It's rather painful to have to migrate from one tenant to another. So if you start off in commercial and you have to migrate to GCC or GCC High, it's less than trivial. There's no easy button, if I would say, for you to be able to migrate from one tenant to another. So we do recommend that you would ultimately look at what your future may hold, as opposed to the initial level of CMMC that you may be striving for. Just a quick word on general validation. To get into the Microsoft government cloud offerings, you do have to be able to provide some evidence that you are part of the defense industrial base. For most of my customers, it's as easy as providing your cage code for your SAM.gov registration. So we made it a lot easier. In the past, you had to get a letter from your sponsor, government agency, et cetera, in order to prove that you were eligible for the government clouds, but now you can do SAM.gov registrations, and those are typically pretty quick to turn around if you don't have one today. The CMMC Acceleration Program. It's exciting to talk about some of the resources we have available. If you look at Microsoft, we are both a cloud service provider and we are also a peer of yours in the defense industrial base. So in terms of looking at our federal services system integrator business, that would include Microsoft Federal. We have Premier Services and we have Microsoft Consulting Services and other delivery, in which case we as a company are also going for a CMMC level 3 initially, and we will go up to a level 5 once we're able to go through an assessment at that level. So now we're actively working on getting a CMMC level 3 of our own. Now that's for our business where we would have a flow down on a DoD contract. Our cloud services offerings, though, I like to say I flip around the hat. So if I'm Microsoft Federal, I'm part of the defense industrial base. If you look at our cloud service offerings such as Microsoft Azure, Azure Government, Office 365, Microsoft 365, the requirement there is that we manage those environments in a set of certifications such as FedRAMP that would give you the opportunity to use it as part of a solution that could be become CMMC compliant. So if you look at that pairing that you would have between, for example, CMMC level 3 with DFAR 7012. 7012 does say that you would have to use a cloud service provider that's either FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So our requirement in terms of being able to provide our cloud service offering to you would be the FedRAMP authorization versus as a system integrator, we would be CMMC certified for services delivery. So they're related and overlapping to some extent, but at the end of the day, our requirement to you as a customer of ours is FedRAMP, not CMMC. In terms of looking at the complete cloud, we offer holistically the most services that you can be able to leverage in order to be able to demonstrate compliance with CMMC. So we've got, of course, the Microsoft 365 security suite that gives you endpoint protection, it gives you encryption with Azure information protection, it gives you identity management with Azure Active Directory, etc. Paired together with some of our other security tools like Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Identity. All those are able to help you to contribute to CMMC, whether you're deploying a workload such as in Office 365 for productivity, such as email, or if you're deploying workloads within Azure that would be your more traditional infrastructure data center. We also have DevOps, of course, with GitHub and Azure DevOps available and CRM solutions. I do have some blogs around the CMMC Acceleration Program as well, and really a big part of the messaging that we have there I'll capture in a quick summary. It really is looking at how you can leverage our cloud service offering not only to inherit some of the controls that you get out of the box just by using the cloud, but you also have the opportunity to leverage those capabilities both for inheritance and as being able to demonstrate compliance with CMMC. The acceleration program is not a SKU particular. It is a collection of resources across our digital estate that will include everything from, of course, the security suite that I mentioned. There's an artifact that we came up with as part of our exercise to do a crosswalk between CMMC and FedRAMP, in which case we, instead of having this unusual looking spreadsheet with a crosswalk, we came up with a new format with the product placemat, which I'll give you a quick peek at here in a moment. The placemat allows you to go in and select the services that you would have, such as Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, and how that moves the needle on how it would impact each of the practices, especially with CMMC level 3 and above. We paired that together with a more document format. So if you look at the placemat, it'd be more like a level 100 view of our services and more informational, but because it's in a spreadsheet view, it really didn't give an opportunity for us to get verbose in terms of giving you guidance or implementation statements. So we've paired that together with the technical reference guide, which really just extends the product placemat to give you a lot more guidance in terms of how to leverage our capabilities and services with each one of the practices for CMMC. We also have our SIM solution is Azure Sentinel. Becomes a requirement with CMMC level 3 and above. We've released a CMMC workbook that really pulls all the logs from all the services. It would include Office 365 and the productivity suite. It would also include any of the services or workloads that you deploy into Azure into a single pane of glass. And the ability to look at and get signals across the entire digital state is fundamental in being able to really do the ongoing care and feeding of your tenant, and to look for proactively look for potential areas for improvement as well as incidents that may occur within your service, and give you a facilitated view of being able to remediate incidents as they occur. We also have STIG automation. So for any of you that are applying STIGs or secure baselines, secure host baseline to your Win 10 or to your Windows Server environments, we do have a STIG automation package as well. It's fully automated. I think it's like infrastructure as code. It's able to apply a STIG not only to your traditional servers that you may be running in your data center, but also to virtual machines and virtual servers running in Microsoft Azure. We also have the compliance manager. Let me just delve into this quickly in a little bit more depth. So if you look at the product placemat for CMMC, it looks like a periodic table, right? So it's an outline for each one of the columns that would align with a practice family within CMMC. And then, of course, each one of the cells would be a CMMC practice. And it progresses, if you look at it, from the level 1 controls all the way to the level 5 controls from top to bottom. And the initial view that you would get whenever you open up the product placemat is what you get to inherit from the service. So all the Microsoft services are turned off except for the actual cloud service offering itself, which would be the underlying data center, et cetera. So you'll find that many of the controls around personnel and physical protection would be something that you get to inherit from Microsoft, at least in a cloud-native environment. And then as you select additional services, such as, let's just say, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, it's going to impact a large spectrum of those controls, especially if you look at adopting strategies around zero trust architecture, where you wouldn't allow for any device to connect to your network or to be able to download or view controlled unclassified information unless that device is trusted. And that translates to having a device that's managed by Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Defender for Endpoint, formerly known as Intune. So for those of you that have worked with Microsoft Intune in the past, we've rebranded it to Endpoint Manager. And it does impact close to 60% of the practices. So I encourage you to download the product placemat and play around with it. Many of my customers that begin with a basic SKU for Office 365 end up finding that as they mature and go into like a CMMC level 3, that they can play around with the mix of products here. And of course we have a prescriptive set of products that you would choose to get CMMC level 3 compliant. But you oftentimes would be moving from a lower SKU to one of the full suite SKUs with Microsoft 365. And that helps you to illustrate it. You can drill down within the product placemat and get implementation guidance. We've further extended this now, as I mentioned, into the technical reference guide. So you can download the technical reference guide and get a full verbose description, not only of implementation guidance for each one of the products that are prescribed for CMMC compliance, but you also have a set of resource links, et cetera, to give you more information coming from Microsoft.com. The Compliance Manager is a tool that's available as part of Microsoft 365, and that is more of the software as a service suite. So the Compliance Manager gives you the ability to overlay what's called assessment templates that would say, okay, let me overlay on top of my tenant a set of controls that are aligned with CMMC level 3, or you can pick anything from level 1 to 5, and be able to get a set of actions that are prescribed. So if you look at those set of actions, it could be enabling multi-factor authentication, or it could be going in and implementing an account lockout policy. And as you take advantage of the Compliance Manager and apply these certain actions that we prescribe to you, two things happen. A, your compliance score is going to rise, so you have a direct indication of what level of compliance that you have in respect to the entire assessment template. It's not aligned to like a SPURS score or something like that, but it is today. It's more of an arbitrary score that we assign to that assessment template. But at the end of the day, if you get to 100, then you've been able to implement all the actions that we've prescribed for you. What you'll find is that it is a full tool for managing and assigning those actions out and documenting how you are achieving those compliance scores. And then it overlays to the CMMC practices. Now, if you follow all the guidance within the compliance manager, it does not mean that you're going to become 100% compliant with CMMC, right? This is really moving the dial towards anything that you can check a checkbox, right, or dot your I, cross your T, in order to have your digital estate within Microsoft configured properly to demonstrate compliance with CMMC. There's always still those human-based processes and documentation that you would need to formalize in order to pass an actual audit. If you look at Azure Security Center is for the Azure Security Center is for Azure Infrastructure as a Service and Platform as a Service, as Compliance Manager is for Software as a Service. So with the Compliance Manager, we've got the CMMC assessment templates that you can overlay Office 365 and the Microsoft 365 Security Suite. Azure Security Center and Defender for Azure is a set of guardrails. The best way I describe it is a ability to apply a set of policies for CMMC on top of an Azure subscription, and how that translates is more into configuring virtual networks and network security groups, etc. So the blueprint we have available today is based on NIST 800-171, and we also have a CMMC level 3 version of that as well. So they're not mutually exclusive, they overlap each other with 110 controls. We've prescribed the CMMC Level 3 policy initiative now to overlay, for example, landing zones, which is infrastructure as a code. It's the ability to say, hey, I'm going to stand up a new greenfield subscription inside of Azure. I'm going to apply this CMMC landing zone, and it would automatically configure and give you at least a baseline configuration of Azure that you can then begin deploying workloads into. So you'll find that initial landing zone for Azure is pretty close to compliant with CMMC, but as soon as you deploy a workload in there, of course there's additional work that you would need to do with each one of those workloads. The policies that we apply do give you the prescriptive actions to go and complete on each workload as you deploy it in there, such as if you go create a virtual machine, it's going to give you a requirement to go and do disk encryption that's FIPS compliant. And if you do that, you'll check the checkbox and that'll show up as green, and it'll raise your secure score. I know we're running close here on time. Let me go ahead and wrap up here. If you look at the CMMC Acceleration Program, we have several more capabilities, zero trust architectures, et cetera, that we're releasing as part of the program. And these resources will continue to evolve. A big part of the value of the CMMC Acceleration Program today is not just direct to our customers, but many of our partners use it. I think of it as scaffolding for our partners to build their service offerings on as well. So some of the boutique partners around the defense industrial base would leverage our capabilities, such as the acceleration program, as a building blocks for offers that they have, such as managed services.